The final goodbye. The church was silent, filled only with the weight of sorrow that hung in the air like an invisible fog. A silence so deep that even the softest of sounds, like a cough or the shuffle of someone shifting in their seat, seemed to echo. It was the kind of silence that grits your heart, wraps it in an iron fist, and refuses to let go. The air felt heavy, filled with grief that no words could truly capture. There was no escaping it. For those who had gathered, the pain was raw, palpable, and irreversible. Beneath the intricate stained glass windows that bathed the room in a pale, almost ethereal light, a dark oak casket rested at the center of the chapel aisle. The light from the windows created a soft halo around the casket, but there was no warmth in it. Just an empty space, a void where a man, one who had been a soldier, a brother, a hero, used to stand. Elijah Calloway was gone. His body was still, lying in the casket, draped by a neatly folded American flag, its deep blue and red contrasting sharply with the solemnity of the moment. Elijah had survived explosions, ambushes, freezing desert nights, and battles that most couldn't even begin to imagine. He had walked through hell and back, fighting for his country, his brothers in arms, and the ideals he held dear. Yet here he was, lying motionless, while his comrades, those who had stood by him through thick and thin, stood like statues, unable to move, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. They were soldiers, after all, but even soldiers have hearts, and those hearts were breaking now. In the front pew, Margaret, Elijah's sister, sat with her hands tightly clasped, trembling as she held a tissue in her lap. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her body seemed to shrink as the reality of her brother's death pressed in on her like a physical weight. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop herself from imagining Elijah as he once was, full of life, laughter, and a sense of purpose that made him a beacon to those around him. But now, that light had been snuffed out, and all she had left were memories, and those memories felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. But there was someone in that room who felt this loss even more deeply than anyone could possibly understand. A companion, a friend, a partner in the truest sense. Orion, the German Shepherd K9, stood quietly at the entrance of the chapel, his leash held firmly by one of the officers. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing erratic and filled with anxiety, as if he knew something was terribly wrong. But for a moment, he didn't move. His eyes scanned the room, his nose sniffing the air, trying to make sense of the change in the atmosphere. Orion had been Elijah's partner for years, through some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. They had been inseparable, a team unlike any other. Orion had been trained for battle, for searching, for protection, for obedience. But there was no training in the world that could have prepared him for the moment he was now facing, the moment when his handler, the person he trusted above all else, was gone. And nothing could have prepared anyone in the chapel for what happened next. Suddenly, without warning, Orion's body stiffened. His eyes, once calm and steady, were now wide with something that seemed too human to be coming from an animal: desperation. The tension in the room shifted slightly, as if everyone felt the pull of something unspoken. And then, with a sudden, forceful tug, Orion broke free from the officer's grip. The sound of his paws hitting the polished wooden floor rang out through the chapel, a sharp contrast to the stillness that had filled the room. His body was tense, and every muscle seemed to ache with urgency. His nails clicked against the floor as he sprinted down the aisle, his eyes locked on one single thing: the casket that held his handler, his soldier, his best friend. The officers tried to move, to stop him, but it was too late. Before anyone could react, Orion leaped. Gasps filled the room as the K9 landed on top of the casket with a soft thud, his paws pressing gently against the flag that lay atop Elijah's body. For a moment, it seemed as though the very air in the chapel had been sucked out, replaced by a collective sense of shock and disbelief. Was it possible? Was this really happening? Orion curled his body against Elijah's, his nose sniffing the soldier's uniform frantically, as though searching for the faintest sign that his partner was still alive. His ears perked up, his body trembling, but there was no response. No movement, no sign that Elijah was coming back. A low, mournful whimper escaped Orion's throat, and it was a sound so full of sorrow and desperation that it seemed to pull at the very hearts of everyone who heard it. The dog's whimpers grew softer, slower, as he laid his head on Elijah's chest, the weight of his grief slowly consuming him. The room fell into complete silence again. No one moved. No one dared to make a sound. All eyes were on the dog who had given everything for his partner, now lying still in the face of an unthinkable loss. Orion had seen the horrors of war, had been trained to endure pain and hardship, but this was different. This was the loss of the one person who had been his world, his protector, his guide, his friend. And in that moment, the world outside the chapel seemed to fade away. It was just Orion and Elijah, alone in their grief, together in a bond that no one could ever fully understand. The K9 lay against Elijah's body, and though the room was filled with people, it felt eerily empty. The love and loyalty between them was enough to fill the entire chapel, even if no one else could truly comprehend the depth of that bond. But just as the silence stretched on, something unexpected happened. Something that would leave everyone in that room shaken, unable to forget the moment that followed. The deepest grief. The chapel remained still, as if the very walls were holding their breath. No one dared to break the silence. Not even the faintest whisper dared to stir the air. The weight of loss pressed down on every person in that room, heavier than any physical burden. The mourners, soldiers, and civilians alike, were frozen in a collective pause, eyes fixed on the K9, Orion, who had made his final stand beside his fallen soldier. For a moment, it was as though time had stopped altogether. The sun outside, which had been shining so brightly just minutes before, seemed to fade into the shadows as the world within the chapel held its collective breath. The faint echo of a sob slipped from someone's lips in the back of the room, but it didn't break the silence. It only added to the sorrow that hung like a shroud over everyone present. Orion, the German Shepherd K9, lay on the casket with his head resting on Elijah's chest, his dark eyes closed for a moment in a solemn, quiet vigil. His fur, once clean and polished from his years of service, was matted slightly from his desperate run down the aisle. His body, usually so poised and alert, was now still, as if the very essence of his being had settled into a state of mourning. He had been through so much, so many battles, so many scars, but none of that could have prepared him for the unthinkable. His handler, his best friend, was gone. The soldiers around the chapel could hardly process what they were witnessing. They had known Orion as a fierce, disciplined working dog. He had tracked enemies through the dust, sniffed out explosives, and stood with them through gunfire and explosions. But they had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so desperate, so human in his grief. Margaret, Elijah's sister, stood frozen in the front pew, her hand trembling as it clutched a tissue. Her face, already red and swollen from crying, now wore an expression of disbelief as she watched the dog that had been by her brother's side for so many years. She could barely breathe, could barely think. The room had turned into a blur of figures, of soldiers, of friends, of family, but all she could focus on was Orion, and how much he, too, had lost. Her mind raced back to the days when Elijah and Orion had been inseparable. Elijah had always said that he and Orion shared a bond unlike anything he had ever experienced. He would joke about how the dog had saved his life more times than he could count, and how they had become brothers, blood thickened by shared danger and undying loyalty. It had always seemed like such a natural partnership, the dog and his handler, as though they were two halves of the same being. But now, seeing Orion curled against Elijah, she realized that their bond went far deeper than anyone could ever truly understand. The officer who had been holding Orion's leash was hesitant to approach. The deep growl that had rumbled from Orion earlier when someone tried to move him away still echoed in the officer's mind. It wasn't an angry growl. It was something more primal, more protective. Orion wasn't just a dog in that moment. He was a guardian, refusing to leave the side of his fallen soldier. His loyalty to Elijah had transcended everything. Rank, training, orders. "Let him be." The chaplain's voice spoke softly, but with a weight that cut through the room. "He's grieving just like the rest of us." No one challenged the chaplain. No one could. The officer stood motionless, his grip on Orion's leash loosening slightly, as if he understood. They had all lost someone that day, someone who had been a part of them, in ways that words couldn't even capture. Margaret stood, wiping away her tears, as her voice broke through the silence, barely above a whisper. "He doesn't understand," she murmured, her words shaking. "He thinks Elijah is coming back. He always did that. When he'd get knocked down in the field, Orion would nudge him, and Elijah would get up. But this time, he won't." Her words, though soft, carried through the room. The soldiers around her nodded quietly, some with their heads bowed, others staring ahead, helpless. They had seen their comrades fall in combat, had witnessed the pain and the grief that came with such losses. But this was something different. This was a love and loyalty that went beyond the battlefield. This was the love of a dog for the person who had been his entire world, a bond unbroken, even by death. Orion's ears twitched, and his body shifted slightly as he leaned further against Elijah. He nudged his nose against Elijah's arm, just as he had countless times before when he needed his partner to rise from the ground after a fall. The act was simple but poignant, and it seemed to carry with it an unspoken plea. "Get up, soldier, get up." But Elijah didn't respond. There was no sudden stirring, no movement. The stillness of death hung over the room, leaving Orion with nothing but silence in return. The K9's body stiffened, his breathing growing shallower, as though he had accepted the reality that his partner would never rise again. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Orion's eyes lock onto Elijah's face, his gaze filled with confusion, loss, and an unbearable sorrow. The dog's movements grew slower, almost resigned, as he rested his head against Elijah's chest once more. He let out a soft whimper, the sound heavy with sadness, before finally closing his eyes. And then, just as suddenly as the stillness had taken hold, something shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Orion's ears flicked again. His body went rigid. His deep brown eyes shot open and locked onto something no one else could see. His breathing quickened, shallow and fast, and his head lifted slightly. Margaret, who had been holding her breath, was the first to notice. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched the K9's every move. "Orion," she whispered, taking a step toward the dog. She was unsure of what she had just seen. Was he sensing something? The other soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. They had seen this dog track and detect things in ways humans couldn't. But this was different. Orion was no longer looking at the casket at Elijah. His gaze was fixed on something else, something that didn't belong to this world. "What is it, boy?" Margaret whispered again, her voice barely audible. But Orion didn't move. He just kept staring, his eyes focused intently on a space in front of the chapel, far beyond the people, the casket, the mourners. It was as if he had found something, or someone, that only he could sense. The air in the chapel seemed to thicken, and Margaret's chest tightened as she felt a chill run down her spine. What was happening? Why was Orion acting like this? The answer, if there was an answer, was hidden in the silence that now gripped the room, waiting for something more to unfold. The unseen presence. The chapel's air had shifted once more. What had started as a silent room filled with sorrow and mourning now pulsed with an unexplainable energy, a tension that hung heavy in the air. No one dared to speak. Even the faintest breath seemed too loud. The atmosphere was electric with a sense of anticipation that no one could quite name. Orion, still lying by Elijah's side, had become the focus of every single person in the room, not because of the grief he expressed, but because of something that was beginning to stir, a quiet force, invisible to everyone but him. Margaret, still standing at the front of the chapel, couldn't tear her eyes away from the dog. She had known him for years, seen him trained in the harshest conditions, and had always admired his sharp instincts. But now, with his deep brown eyes locked onto something in the distance, she couldn't help but feel a knot of unease twist in her stomach. The sense of calm that had briefly returned to the room was gone. Instead, there was a subtle but undeniable feeling that something extraordinary was happening, something beyond the ordinary reach of grief or human understanding. As she watched, the seconds seemed to stretch into minutes. Orion's body remained still, his tail loosely curled against his side, but the air around him seemed to hum with an invisible force. His head was raised ever so slightly, his eyes fixed on a point just beyond the casket, beyond the mourners, beyond the walls of the chapel. Margaret felt her breath hitch as she stood frozen, her heart racing in her chest. "What's he looking at?" Sergeant Dwayne Carter, one of Elijah's fellow soldiers, whispered from behind her. His voice was hoarse, filled with disbelief and confusion. The other soldiers, too, looked on with growing concern. They had been through enough combat to understand what it meant to be alert. But this was something they couldn't prepare for. Orion wasn't tracking an enemy. He wasn't sensing danger. No, there was something else. Something invisible, something only the dog could perceive. Margaret felt the weight of his gaze on her, but her own eyes kept shifting toward Orion's. She glanced quickly at the other mourners. The once comforting sight of familiar faces, those who had stood by her family for years, was now filled with a sense of dread. Even the chaplain, usually so composed, appeared unsettled. His fingers gripped the Bible in his hands, his face pale, his expression unreadable. It was as though the very essence of the room had changed, the very fabric of reality warped by something unseen. "Orion," Margaret called softly, taking another tentative step toward him. The words barely escaped her lips before they were swallowed by the silence. The dog's eyes didn't shift toward her. He remained fixed, unmoving, his gaze locked on something that none of them could comprehend. A low whimper escaped Orion's throat, a sound so soft, yet filled with so much weight, so much unspoken emotion. It wasn't a cry of pain, nor a sound of distress, but something else, something that seemed to ask a question, to call out for an answer that would never come. His ears twitched as though listening for something, some response from a place beyond the walls of the chapel, beyond even the living world. The soldiers, who had been through the chaos of war, the thundering sounds of gunfire and explosions, now stood frozen, each one struggling to understand what they were seeing. They knew Orion. They knew the fierceness and loyalty that defined him. They had fought beside him in the harshest conditions, trusted him with their lives. But never had they seen him like this. Never had they witnessed him in a moment so personal, so vulnerable. Orion wasn't just a war dog anymore. He was a grieving soul, lost without the one person who had been his everything. "What's happening?" Margaret whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Her voice trembled as she spoke. She knew the dog was special, that his bond with Elijah had been something remarkable, but now it felt as if that bond transcended everything they had ever known. As if hearing her question, Orion gave a soft sigh, a deep exhale that seemed to carry the weight of his sorrow. His body relaxed slightly, but not fully. He wasn't letting go. Not yet. He remained curled against Elijah, his head resting gently against the soldier's chest. His eyes, now calm yet filled with something deeply soulful, moved toward the mourners. It was as though he had sensed a shift, a change in the atmosphere, a new presence. The chaplain took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a brief moment, his expression grave. Sometimes he began softly, his voice thick with emotion. Dogs see what we cannot. They understand loss in a way that we can only begin to fathom. But perhaps they also see what lies beyond. What we cannot see, what we cannot know. They're more attuned to it than we are. The chaplain's words hung in the air, their weight settling on the room like a heavy blanket. Margaret's heart pounded as she processed what he had said. The suggestion that there might be something beyond the here and now, that there might be something on the other side of grief that Orion could sense, something the living couldn't even begin to comprehend, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Suddenly, without warning, Orion's posture shifted again. His head turned slightly, and his eyes, now filled with a deep, unwavering focus, moved to something none of the others could see. His entire body went still, yet there was a sense of tension in him, a sense of waiting. Margaret, heart racing, took another slow step forward. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly as she stretched it toward the dog's fur. "Orion," she whispered, as if trying to bring him back to her world. But Orion's gaze didn't leave the unseen thing before him. His body was still, but there was an undeniable presence about him, something that went beyond the physical. And then, as if answering the unspoken question, a soft sound, a breath, almost imperceptible, escaped from the canine's throat. It wasn't a whimper, nor a bark, but something else entirely. A sound that seemed to carry a sense of recognition, as though he had finally understood whatever it was that had been lingering just beyond the veil. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek, and in that moment she understood. Whatever Orion had been sensing, whatever he had felt, had finally brought him peace, and with that, the tension in the room seemed to lift ever so slightly. The air, which had been thick with grief and confusion, softened just enough for those in the chapel to exhale. The soldiers around Margaret began to stir. Some shifted in their seats, others stood slowly, unsure of how to move, how to process what had just transpired. The chaplain, still holding his Bible, quietly murmured a prayer under his breath. "May they both find peace," he whispered, "in this life and the next." Orion, having made his final peace, lowered his head once more, his body softening as he rested beside Elijah, his partner in life and in death. The room, still heavy with loss, slowly began to breathe again, as the mourners felt the strange presence of something beyond their understanding, something that had been witnessed only by Orion. The final moment. The room remained quiet, almost reverent, as if the weight of everything, grief, loss, love, had settled into every corner of the chapel. The air felt different now, thinner, charged with something invisible, something unspoken. The energy that had once been so thick, so oppressive, had begun to lift, and a faint sense of calm slowly began to settle over the mourners. Orion, the canine who had once been a soldier, now lay still beside Elijah, his head resting against his fallen handler's chest. His breathing was slow, measured, the deep, rhythmic sighs of an animal who had finally come to terms with a reality that had been too hard to understand. He had been through so much, fighting alongside Elijah in places that most couldn't imagine, tracking enemies, protecting his team, saving lives. But this was different. This was the kind of loss that transcended duty, the kind of loss that cut to the heart. Margaret, still standing at the front of the chapel, took a deep, steadying breath. She watched as Orion, so full of energy and life just hours before, now lay quietly beside her brother, as though the bond they had shared in life had not been broken by death. She had always known that Orion had a special connection with Elijah, that their bond was something few could understand. But seeing it now, the depth of the loyalty, the devotion, and the love that Orion still felt for Elijah, despite his absence, it struck Margaret to her core. As she moved closer to the casket, she found herself fighting back tears, though they came anyway, slipping down her cheeks as she reached out to gently touch Orion's fur. The dog didn't flinch or pull away, only sighing deeply as if comforted by her presence. She could feel the warmth of him, still alive with the memory of her brother, still anchored in the shared love and loss. and as her fingers stroked his fur, she realized something powerful. There was a part of Elijah that would never truly be gone. His legacy lived on in Orion, in the way the dog had remained steadfast, loyal, and devoted, even in the face of the greatest sorrow. The soldiers, too, began to stir, quietly moving toward the front of the chapel. They had watched the bond between Elijah and Orion unfold over the years. They had seen the way the dog had responded to Elijah's commands with precision and discipline, how they had moved together as one unit. But now, watching Orion's quiet grief, they too felt the weight of the loss. They had lost a brother, a comrade, someone they had trusted with their lives. But Orion had lost something more. He had lost his other half, the one person who had always been there for him, who had loved him, who had been his constant in the chaos of war. A few of the soldiers knelt beside the casket, their heads bowed in respect. And one by one, they took turns placing their hands gently on the flag that lay atop Elijah's body. They didn't speak. There were no words needed. They understood the silence, the mourning, the finality of the moment. Orion, ever faithful, didn't move, but his eyes, those soulful brown eyes, followed them all. There was no aggression, no threat in his gaze, only a deep sadness, a longing, a wish for something that could never be. Then something extraordinary happened. As Margaret stood there, her hand on Orion's head, she felt a gentle tug on her heart, a feeling, a presence that made her stop and look up. It was as if the room had shifted again, as if something unspoken had passed between them all. A deep, undeniable sense that Elijah had, in his own way, never truly left. His spirit, his courage, his love, his legacy, was still alive in the memories of those who had known him. It was alive in the bond shared between him and Orion, in the strength of the soldiers around her, and in the way the chapel felt now, less empty, less final.